Okay, well, I don't want to just rehash what everyone else in the room believes. I don't want to just give a general affirmation. I think we're all on the same page as to the flaws of the Iran agreement and how it enables Iran basically to do what it wants to do. A good way of looking at this is, given the $100 billion to $150 billion in sanctions relief, what John Kerry managed to do was not only strike a deal with Iran, but strike a deal with Iran which in effect would finance retroactively 2 decades of covert nuclear and ballistic missile work. So not only do we now have this agreement that has regularized and normalized Iran's program, but in effect Iran gets all the back cash to finance it, rewards it for its defiance. When we look ahead, there's a couple things I would worry about and I just want to flag. First of all, for all the discussion in the New York Times and elsewhere that the Supreme Leader has endorsed this deal, that's absolute nonsense. The Supreme Leader posted, I believe 2 days ago on his website, a explanation, and he said very clearly and distinctly that when he praises the nuclear negotiating team, some people have interpreted this as an endorsement of the deal at which they arrived. And he says this would be a mistaken interpretation. So we do need to keep in mind that the Supreme Leader is playing footsie with this deal a bit, and at least for the time being taking plausible deniability with regard until it's approved through the processes. And what he actually said in his broader explanation is this nuclear file has been going on under 3 presidents, 3 Iranian presidents, and there's a process it needs to go through before I chime in on it. Now, of course, he's intimately involved in every aspect of this, but the fact that he's not going to come out and say, I embrace this, makes it all the more incredible that we are willing to put ourselves forward in that way. Much more importantly, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has not gone forward and embraced this in any way. And indeed, both they and the Supreme Leader are insistent that the deal continue to abide by all their red lines. And the Supreme Leader back in June was nice enough to tweet out a reiteration with an explanation of his red lines, and this went into the issue of absolutely no inspections of military sites. So forget the whole idea of Kerry lying about anytime, anywhere inspections going into the managed inspections of 24+ days. And you're at a point where there will be no inspections of military sites. This is one of the reasons why perhaps in the IAEA side deal they said that Iran could take its own samples. That's a nice diplomatic way of saying there's no inspections of Parchin. But at the same time, we can all see the problem with it. And the analogy which is constantly bantered about because it's so accurate, it's like trying to give someone a drug test and not supervising that you're actually getting the right person's urine. So you have that issue. Now, this raises, by the way, what I consider should be a Plan B. Plan A is to defeat the bill. Plan B would be if President Obama is able to rally the Democrats to a point where this becomes an agreement, what mechanisms do we have to force an inspection as soon as possible to find Iran in noncompliance before that $100 billion windfall gets released to Iran? And the problem here, of course, is can you get the Obama administration, which probably knows deep down that the Iranians aren't really going to abide by this, or they have Stockholm Syndrome or whatever, to actually force an inspection. But the more that can be worked up as Plan B, I think it would be useful. Other issues that are out there that I worry are going to become concerns. It's not only Section 28 of the agreement, which in David Addington's essay is highlighted from Heritage, but also Section 35. And basically what we're doing is not only saying that public officials need to put forward an endorsement of this deal, but no states or anyone else is able to re-sanction any entities. And if they do, then Iran is allowed, if they even perceive there to be a violation of this clause, they are allowed simply to walk away from the agreement legally. And they have nothing to lose because they're getting their $100 billion up front. So this means if the state of Massachusetts, as in the past, for example, wants to sanction Iran for human rights violations, that's a violation of the deal. Iran can simply walk away. Not only is this an extreme overreach on the part of the State Department, John Kerry, and the White House, infringes on federalism and everything like that, it's probably unconstitutional. But it also gives Iran a trapdoor, and they will take advantage of it. And the Iranians have bested the Americans at every point in time when we get into the nitty-gritty of the interpretations of some of these trapdoors. And the reason for that also is because John Kerry, more often than not, has decided to act as their lawyers. Another issue which I think could be put forward in a bipartisan way, given the antagonism which the White House approach to the Corker-Cardin compromise has caused, the White House decision just to go right to the UN, is to make it clear, Kerry doesn't care, but to make it clear to Kerry's staff, to Wendy Sherman's staff, to Samantha Power and her staff, that under no circumstances will anyone who's been involved in this ever get another confirmation, that they have abused the trust of the U.S. Congress. And this is something that is a precedent both for Democrats and Republicans. It's not a partisan issue, and it's not like among all the ambitious young Democrats or Republicans that in a situation like this, if one person gets blackballed, that the party can't come up with someone else who abides by the same philosophy, but just hasn't given Congress their big middle finger, the way this administration and the staff now have. Given all the lawyers and the staff, they knew exactly what they were doing. So, in short, that is my concern. Oh, one other aspect. This idea that this money is going to go for good flies in the face of Iranian history, that the Iranians are going to spend this on the people. There's two reasons why this is nonsense. Number one is history. Between the year 2000 and the year 2005, European Union trade with Iran almost tripled. At the same time, if we just expand it out a little bit, between 1999 and 2006, the price of oil quintupled. Iran took that hard currency windfall and invested the overwhelming majority of it into their nuclear and ballistic missile programs. The Supreme National Security Council chairman at the time was one Hassan Rouhani. He's the guy distributing the money. So this idea that suddenly Hassan Rouhani is going to take that money and give it to soup kitchens is absolutely naive, and it flies into the face of this idea also that the Bush administration was to blame, because when the Bush administration came in, there were 164 centrifuges or whatever it was. When they left, there were 12,000. Therefore, the problem was too much coercion. What the people making this argument forget is that you had this flood of European money into Iran at the same time, and it was that European money which is financing and funding the various centrifuges. So the problem wasn't too little diplomacy, it was too much diplomacy. At the same time, this talking point which the Obama administration and its fellow travelers put forward also ignores the fact of the 20% enrichment, which is wholly owned by the Obama administration. Then structurally, the other issue which we need to keep in mind is Khatam al-Anbiya. Khatam al-Anbiya, which is in Arabic means seal of the prophets, is the economic wing of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The basic history of this is the Revolutionary Guards rose to prominence inside the Iranian system during the Iran-Iraq War when Khomeini got on the radio and said, it's like drinking a chalice of poison, but I have no choice but to drink this if I want the regime to survive, which, by the way, is one historical example of Iran caving under tremendous economic pressure, by the way. When you have a situation like that, the Revolutionary Guard decided that they wanted to stay elite. They didn't want to subordinate themselves to the parliament. The parliament tried to get them under the parliament's thumb, and it just didn't work. I mean, some people were killed when they tried to do that. But the point of this is what the Revolutionary Guard did was they went into civilian enterprises, and without moral equivalence, if you want to understand what Khatam al-Anbiya is today, imagine the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers coupled with Halliburton, coupled with KBR, coupled with Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Exxon, and Shell. That is what Khatam al-Anbiya represents in Iran today. They are involved in the entire oil industry. Under Ahmadinejad, they got more than $50 billion in no-bid contracts, which also, by the way, means they built up such an independent financial base that even if you had a deal which would take the Revolutionary Guard's official budget to zero, they'd be facing less of a proportional cutback than our military is through sequestration. They have, in effect, become financially independent. All the import-export goes through the Revolutionary Guard. Now, some people say sanctions benefited the Revolutionary Guard because they controlled the black markets, and that's absolutely true. But trading with them is only going to benefit them more. And Peugeot, the French automobile maker, when they partner with Pécan, PKAN is owned by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So you have all this issue. You're not going to have trickle-down economy. You're going to be pumping money directly into the wallets, into the purses of the hardliners. And this is something that anyone, Democrats or Republicans among the Iran watchers, know. And the fact that this hasn't been pressed upon suggests that the Obama administration is living in fantasy land. Just anecdotally, when I lived in Tehran, I could walk all around, or Isfahan or Shiraz. Wasn't a problem. But when I would go shopping, I'd always go shopping in mom-and-pop stores, grocery stores. And the reason was, and I talked to some Iranians about this, whenever anyone tried to make too much money, whenever they would try to franchise their grocery store, for example, then suddenly the Revolutionary Guard would come in, and basically it would be like the Chicago Mafia in 1930 or in Chicago Mafia in 2015. And the fact of the matter is, they'd be pushed out of there. And ultimately, until you come up with a mechanism to break that Revolutionary Guard stranglehold over the Iranian economy, there's no hope that this money is going to go to anything but the most militant programs. And with that, just tried to throw thematically a few issues out there. Any questions?
Let me ask you, Michael, thank you. That's a very good short course on the problem. Is there an opposition in Iran anymore? And if so, is it likely to survive what we've just done?
In short, there is an opposition, although not necessarily the type of opposition we'd like to see. And about a decade ago, more than a decade ago, the Terrence Group actually did some polling where they took every telephone exchange in Tehran, they randomized the last 4 digits. And I'm forgetting the actual breakdown, but roughly speaking, they found that 10% of the Iranian population, based on a very professional polling on economic issues, truly believed in this idea put forward by Ayatollah Khomeini and carried forward by Khamenei. Another 15% thought it was a very good idea, but that had been misapplied. These would be the equivalent to the Gorbachev, glasnost, perestroika communists. The next 75% were more or less completely opposed to this idea that this Islamic Republic could ever work. But at the same time, they were apathetic. And they had been promised an Islamic democracy. What they got was neither. Instead, they got a war that killed 1 million people. So ultimately, you got a situation where the problem in Iran among the people isn't opposition to the regime, that's plenty, but rather the apathy. At the same time, what we need to recognize is that intellectually, this idea that the Iranians are automatically pro-Western, pro-American, you know, a lot of people like our sort of freedom and they like what America stands for, but when you look at Iranian intellectual history, one of the greatest trends is basically this leftist paranoia. In Iran, the author was a guy named Jalal Ali Ahmed, who wrote a book. It's been translated into English called, in Persian, Garbzadagi, often translated into West-toxification. And basically, it's this typical thing, almost like Edward Said, blaming everything on the West. So the point of this, before we get to the question I saw from notorious liberal Fred Fleitz, is that when you do look at ordinary Iranians, it's not a coincidence that so many of them flee and then want to meet Noam Chomsky before meeting whoever's in the Oval Office. And so that's going to be a problem which we're going to face into the future. That said, it's a problem that's several orders of magnitude less than the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which would have command, control, and custody over any nuclear weapons program.
The notorious liberal wants to be heard from.
Michael, thanks for coming today. That was a fabulous presentation. We've both written on this issue of Iran collecting its own samples, and I just wanted to say to everyone here, this is really a killer issue to explain it to the American people. Not just this is just a bad deal, but it is an ugly deal. A column I wrote today, an Army officer wrote in using this urine sample example, saying, when I was in the Army, a guy watched me pee into a cup to make sure the sample was legitimate. And we're going to let Iran collect its own samples. This is so easy for members of Congress to use to explain. One comment on what the administration has been saying about centrifuges. Kerry actually said that Obama came to office and Iran had 19,000 centrifuges. James Rosen is very clear about this, that is a lie. 75% of the centrifuges were built during Obama's regime. And I think that's also something we have to say. But I have another comment that you may not expect. Michael, as a notorious conservative and as a conservative Jew, how did you get away with living in Iran? And I imagine your family was scared to death. I'd like to hear that. I did not know you lived in Iran.
Well, first of all, your question from the stewy-eyed liberal Fred Fleitz, your question actually, your first part of your question or your comment sparked something else. When the Corker-Cardin Compromise was written, when talking to the people who actually were able to chop on some of the language, and I recognize the flaws, it was actually, the language was augmented before it was passed to insist that the White House provide the agreement and all annexes and side agreements to it. Yes. Therefore, by withholding the side agreements, and it didn't have to be side agreements signed by the U.S., by withholding the side agreement between the two side agreements between Iran and the IAEA, if the Congress wishes to make an issue of it, and I'm not sure the Congress has the backbone to do it, but if the Congress wishes to make an issue of it, the 60-day review period has not started, and it does not start until all those side agreements are put forward. Now, just in short, with regard to your question, I mean, my Ph.D. was on 19th century Iranian history, specifically on the use of the telegraph inside Iran at this point. It's 600 pages of fascinating reading, although no one has actually read it, because I put a $50 bill in the dissertation in the Yale Library with a note saying, if you get this far, and you only have to get to page 70, my God, this isn't that bad, you can keep the $50 and just send me a postcard. And as far as I know, the $50 bill is still there. But in short, I was working on 19th century history. I interacted a lot with the Jewish, Christian, and Baha'i communities because I didn't want my money going to Hezbollah. I was able to network into them, and I spent 7 months there. But 96 under Rafsanjani, and then 99 under Khatami.
Thanks. I'm a little concerned about the United States being the lawyer for this deal. You know, you say we could make an issue of an inspection quickly, but it seems to me that we're going to be doing the opposite. The example that is put forward is this South African gold transaction, which just occurred, which ought to be an existing violation of the existing sanctions, but the administration doesn't seem to be doing anything about it. I think that's going to be the pattern, and I'd like to know if you have any thoughts about what we can do to force the administration and the individuals in the Department of Treasury and so on to continue to even do their jobs. I mean, they're probably going to be doing everything they can to downplay any Iranian violations.
Well, you're absolutely right on that. And that ultimately goes, it's above my pay grade, but it goes to both the intelligence oversight committees in the Senate and the House and the way in which they're willing to press the feet of the intelligence community to the fire. From what I hear, and again, there's other people in this room who would probably be better at addressing this, I hear of growing division between some of the bean counters at the Defense Intelligence Agency versus some of the analysts at the Central Intelligence Agency, the latter of whom might be under greater political pressure with regard to the specific issue. That's something for the intelligence oversight committees to look into. And at the same time, one has to be very careful with how you address your questions to the CIA or to others in the intelligence community, because we should never assume that the spirit of the question is going to be answered. Only the letter of the question is going to be answered. And in that, it's time to take the gloves off. It's not politicization to do your job and to provide oversight. But, you know, this has been a problem going back to the Yellow Rain controversy in the late 1970s, if not before. Oftentimes, when it comes to the politicization of the intelligence community, and I address this in my book, the vast majority of incidents are in favor of high-profile diplomatic agreements rather than as a desire to create a casus belli. Sarah.
William P. Sarah. Oh, I'm sorry. Hey, Michael, brilliant briefing. I've grown to expect nothing short of that from you. I hope everybody in this room is aware of Annex 3, subsection D, subsection 10 of the agreement, which talks about how the E3+3, which is the new term for P5+1, will have to assist the Iranians in the protection of their nuclear capabilities, including cyber attacks. And does that mean that this deal will enable the Iranians to protect some future Stuxnet or some other non-military method of sabotaging an attack on either the United States or Israel?
Well, what I worry about more, and this being out of my, my comfort zone of career experience, is more the betrayal of sources and methods for whatever we may know, and I don't have insight into that. If our goal is to help protect Iran from this, then perhaps we're explaining our own methods to them in a way that can be detrimental down the pike. But this actually reminds me of another strategy, and it's beside the point of your question going forward. We've talked a great deal about what Iran might do to spend this $100 billion. And even if only 10% of it is spent on quote-unquote resistance, that's $10 billion into the treasury of a terrorist group. A few things that worry me and should be issues for Congress to address. Number one, I would certainly hope that the Armed Services Committees could call the Chief of Naval Operations. Because after all, if this money goes into weaponry, and Iran, while we talk about the 5- and 8-year windows on importing certain types of weaponry, what Iran seems to be claiming is that defensive weaponry, anti-ship missiles, for example, are allowed right away. And given what we saw in 2006 with Hezbollah using an Iranian missile to cripple an Israeli ship, what does this mean in the Persian Gulf, which the Iranians consistently have suggested the Americans have no right to operate in? And for those of you with naval experience, you know the Persian Gulf, because of some of the islands, has extremely narrow shipping lanes, which impact maneuverability. It takes, 26 knots of wind over the deck of an aircraft carrier to launch a plane. And often carriers have trouble maneuvering in such a way as to capture that 26 knots without falling out of their lanes of operation. So you have a situation where our ships are in an area where it's already extremely difficult to operate, and we need to deal with the increasing threat of anti-ship missiles. I can't imagine that any CNO worth his weight is going to say that this is not going to be a grave and immediate threat to the U.S. Navy and U.S. personnel. At the same time, while we all might be on the same page with the fact that after the Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon, the United Nations certified that withdrawal as complete, putting aside the Sheba Farms hard dove controversy, which is manufactured. One thing which we often don't talk about is the Lebanese Hezbollah and the Lebanese government itself has put forward a disputed maritime claim in the Mediterranean to, I think, 300 square miles, either 300 square kilometers or 300 square miles of disputed maritime border with Iran. At the same time, what? Well, with Israel, I'm sorry. At the same time, you have in the open source, and this is coming from, I think, Nicholas Blanchard in the Christian Science Monitor, acknowledgement on the part of one Hezbollah commander that they're working on underwater sabotage. And this poses a grave and growing threat, if that's true, to American personnel in the Mediterranean, because with the development of the gas fields between Israel and Cyprus, and suddenly if you have underwater sabotage, we've seen the Islamic State, for example, operate against the Egyptian Navy in the region. This is becoming a greater problem. And by the way, even though it's a little bit off topic, this is the right audience to address it. The other thing, I have a 6-week-old that's keeping me up at night, but the other thing that's keeping me up at night is that when we look at the whole Greece situation, aside from our naval headquarters, the Sixth Fleet, I guess, in Naples, what's our only military facility, our only naval base in the Mediterranean? It's Ceuta Bay in Crete, in Greece. Because when we look at Rota in Spain, that's actually outside the Strait of Gibraltar. Now, Russia has played hardball before. when it came to some of the military facilities we were using in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, the K2 and the Karshikhanabad K2 or the Manar Air Base in Kyrgyzstan. If they want to play hardball with us vis-a-vis Greece, what's to stop them from either demanding that the American forces are kicked out of Suda Bay in exchange for however many billion, or at least, the very least, bidding the cost up to get our Navy to allow our Navy to stay there at a time of declining revenue. So ultimately, that's another worry I have that comes out of this in our general geostrategic position.
Sorry. I'm a former naval officer. Just to reiterate your point, first of all, most of the time the carriers operate outside the Persian Gulf in order to maintain that freedom of ability to maneuver. But the other part of it is I'm sorry, I forgot my other point. But something about the CNO. You were saying the CNO should be called to testify. Unfortunately, as an objective observer, the chances of him giving good answers are very, very low. Unfortunately, our CNOs and Joint Chiefs of Staff end up having their political allegiance to the presidency, assuming a higher role than their allegiance to the country, is my comment on that.
Well, my response to both of those questions. Number one, I guess Ace is on vacation today. He told me in advance he'd be on vacation today. But you have any number of former admirals who could easily be called to give their answers before the public hearing. And granted, I'm pulling this out of my hat because I've never really worked on the Hill, aside from my short time as a Congressional Black Caucus Foundation fellow working for Bill Gray years ago. But
You've come a long way, baby.
exactly. But you got that situation when it comes to the Persian Gulf. Just a short note of inquiry. You're absolutely right. Look, before 1991, the United States didn't send any carriers into the Gulf. Between 1991 and 2003, on average, we had one carrier strike group in the Gulf. Between 2003 and 2011, on average, we had two carrier strike groups. It's now down to one, and the carriers will actually go into the Gulf. You're absolutely right. They prefer to maneuver outside. But they will go into the Gulf to make their port calls and so forth. And part of the problem is also psychological. Because when we talk about a pivot to Asia, what everyone in the Persian Gulf heard was a repeat of, was it Prime Minister Wilson's East of Suez speech with the precipitous withdrawal of British forces from the Persian Gulf. That's how it was filtered throughout their own experience, and so we're forced into the position, and the Navy will say this quite openly, of having to show the flag only to convince some of our Persian Gulf, our GCC allies, if we care about them anymore, that withdrawing a carrier isn't a withdrawal of support.
Michael, you mentioned the Egyptian conflict with ISIS. I saw yesterday, I think, a story which really just reinforces your previous point. The Islamic State actually sank an Egyptian ship with what I think was an anti-tank missile or something that they managed to bring to bear on it. Have you heard that, and is that...
That's actually what I was referring to. I honestly don't know whether it sank or not, but it was an ambush.
Didn't think it was on fire.
Okay. But it's not the first time the terrorists in the Sinai have conducted this sort of thing, and they've given out SOS calls to try to get SOS calls to fishing boats in order to try to get Egyptian Coast Guard out, and then they will fire on, and so forth. Put it this way. I give a lecture sometimes with regard to, just as a big picture thought question for more senior military officers about whether the Eastern Mediterranean in a decade is going to have the strategic importance that the Persian Gulf has now, and if that's the case, what would be our necessary military posture in that region? I mean, if we look at the Persian Gulf, we have Jebel Ali, we have Camp Arafjan in Kuwait, we have Al Udeid in Qatar, we have the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain and so forth. In the Eastern Mediterranean, all we have is Suda Bay, and that's not enough.
Anyone else? Joel?
Saudis originally signaled their displeasure with the Iranian agreement, but yesterday they started making noises that this might be okay. And is this a typical Saudi play of playing both sides against the middle, or is there something more significant going on?
Well, this is what frustrates me about, to put it bluntly, the amateurish, what's the word? Amateurishness of the White House and senior diplomatic correspondents. Because stepping back, when we first started the negotiations on the Joint Plan of Action, the United Arab Emirates gave just a boilerplate endorsement saying it's always useful to solve our disputes through diplomacy. And Susan Rice and the White House were rolling that out to suggest that even our Gulf allies supported what we were doing. Behind the scenes, absolutely everyone that went to the Emirates or to Kuwait or to Bahrain or elsewhere came back with tales of just how incredibly bitter and distrustful their various administrations were. The same thing is true with Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, I just saw on Twitter as I was Ubering out here, has said that we need to be a nuclear power within 10 years, and who could see that coming? The point of this is we can't, the second you listen to diplomatic politeness, and I'm not accusing you of doing this, obviously, is a leading question. The second anyone listens to diplomatic politeness and addresses it with 100% sincerity, that's the real problem. And it was in the Washington Free Beacon, but what was interesting, and I'll be looking at this again as soon as I get back to the office, last Friday, of course, when Ayatollah Khamenei gave his Friday prayers, when you actually looked at the Persian on the podium, he was lecturing from a podium which said in Persian, "We will trample America beneath our feet." And in English, it was quoting Ayatollah Khomeini as saying, "We defeat America." And what really frustrates me in this case is Thomas Erdbrink, the New York Times correspondent, one of the only Western correspondents in Tehran, who was tweeting out how the Friday prayer leader was moderately endorsing the deal and didn't see fit to mention what the big letters on the podium actually said. He's married to an Iranian woman. I don't accept the excuse that he didn't know what they said, especially when in English it had Khomeini, "We will defeat United States." More.
Did you see the piece that Prince Bandar wrote yesterday, attacking the deal?
Yeah.
Up and down.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent, I've sort of lost contact with my old friend Prince Bandar, but that's a long story. But to what extent does he have a great deal of influence still in Saudi Arabia? Do you?
Well, put it this way. I don't know. I've never been much of a Saudi watcher. And one of the things that I'm actually surprised about is given, and I'm no huge fan of Saudi Arabia. I've been there 3 times. It's not the most pleasant place, and you can't excuse them for some of what they funded in the past. At the same time, interests converge, and I'm surprised that when they spent so much money bashing certain segments of Washington in the past, that they can't figure out how to, at the cost of no money, simply reach out to people more, because there would be some interesting discussions to be had on this. With regard to Saudi Arabia into the future, the fact that Mohammed bin Naif, I guess, is now the crown prince is significant because he's one of the more sectarian of Saudi players, and I will fault him incredibly with regard to some of the unnecessarily provocative actions. He's sectarian, racist against Shiites. Okay. I'll fault him incredibly with necessary provocations which he's made in eastern Saudi Arabia. I don't see all Shiites as pawns of Iran. In fact, Iran would like us to see them that way, but ultimately, if we're going to break Iran's grip, we got to break Hezbollah's grip, reach out to ordinary middle-class Lebanese Shiites and so forth, reach out to Bahraini Shiites. It's a subject for a different argument. That said, the fact that Mohammed bin Naif is so hard-line when it comes to these issues, I don't see Saudi Arabia moderating its position anytime soon. In fact, I would imagine that Prince Bandar and Mohammed bin Naif are having quite a party now.
Could you address in that regard, Michael, a little crystal ball gazing? And I honestly, I can't quite get a clarity about what the number is. I heard Adam Schiff say it was $59 billion yesterday on CNN. There's $100 billion that you've referred to. There's $150 billion. 50 billion.
No, I mean,
So but
It all
that
depends.
wasn't really the question. The question I wanted to get at, but if you could address that, well, that would be good. But
short answer is we don't know, because when we're talking about this money, it's not American taxpayer money that's going. It's frozen assets. I mean, the Iranians could say technically it is Iranian money held in other banks. When it comes to unsold oil and so forth, once oil enters the market, it's going to decrease the price of oil. But at the same time, Iran is often cheated by selling discounted oil. Now they don't need to sell discounted oil more, so they can make more money when they do sell the oil. What these figures don't take into account is all the new investment which will be pouring into Iran, mostly in the short and medium term, because Iran doesn't have commercial law, and therefore no one is going to put their faith in the long-term ability of Iran to uphold its contracts. So you have a situation where simply no one knows. I always tend to use the $100 billion because it seems to be the middle ballpark, and I always try to underestimate rather than overestimate and exaggerate, just for the sake of being understated can win the argument.
let me ask you, just because we're going to need to move on, about Turkey. There was a development there in the past 24 hours,
Yeah.
and I'd like you to help me understand what it means.
Okay, when it comes to Turkey, ultimately, I remain deeply suspicious of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and while we had this suicide bombing, which the Turks are blaming on the Islamic State, suddenly we have Turkey seeming to switch positions and allow the United States to conduct airstrikes from Turkish soil and so forth. I'm not sure that this is about the Islamic State. We all know about the elections in Turkey. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, because the Kurds got past the 10% threshold, lost his absolute majority. That means he has to go into a coalition. If he cannot form a coalition in 45 days, and the clock is now ticking from the time in which he charged Ahmet Davutoglu to put together that coalition, you have new elections. And when you go through all the different paths they go down, new elections would probably be in November. If you can create some sort of crisis, there's two possibilities here. Either the Kurds, the second time around, aren't going to pass the 10% threshold, either legitimately or because they're going to be suppressed through dirty tricks or what have you. Then Erdogan emerges from this as a dictator again. At the same time, if you can go into war footing, then you can have a reason, by nature of national security emergency, to delay the elections indefinitely, and Erdogan remains the undisputed leader while this happens. So either way, I see this more about suppressing the Kurds and maintaining Erdogan's grip on power than on anything else. I mean, frankly.
Okay. Michael, thank you.
Thank
As
you.
always, tremendous.